Well, hello there, everyone. My name is Kevin Porman, though I may look a little different today. With me, I have a special guest, Brian Kwong, and today we're going to be talking on codeLive about replacing the Undead workflow rules with some flows here. So, as you may have heard at Dreamforce 19, there was a bit of a workflow rule announcement. We'll call it an announcement. I think that's fair. And today we're going to be working on creating a couple of workflow rules and then looking at how to replace those workflow rules with actual flows in the flow builder. Does that make sense? Did I capture that right, Brian?
You did capture a right, Stay Puft Marshmallow Man.
Yes, and Brian, for those out there watching who are not familiar with you, do you want to introduce yourself a little bit?
Absolutely. My name is Brian Kwong. I'm a VP of Delivery and Operations for a partner called Better Partners. And I've been a Salesforce MVP for I don't know how many more years now, and a co-leader of the Madison, Wisconsin admin group. I've been active in Salesforce for over a decade, and with Mark Ross, we actually coined the term Flownatics at a Dreamforce session one year. Um, some other people may know me simply as the Salesforce Wizard, primarily because I wear this hat at Dreamforce and almost every other Salesforce event. And my specialty over the last few years has basically become Flow Builder. So I'm really excited to show how Flow can replace your workflow rules.
That's really cool. And just out of curiosity, I don't know that I know the answer to this. Like? How did you come up with Salesforce Wizard?
Um, it was back in 2007, 2008. Visual Force had just come out not that long ago. And so I was creating all these Visual Force pages to help users walk through a process, so a wizard. And we had a
Oh,
costume day, and I thought, wouldn't it be hilarious if I grabbed a wizard costume and plastered the Salesforce logo, which is this little red square back then, all
yeah.
over it, on my hat and on the robe. And I had someone steal my hat, sew it on, and then I wore it once at the vendor area at Dreamforce, and someone took my picture, and I was up on the big jumbotron, and that was that.
That's fantastic. You're a little outdated on your branding, though. We should work on that.
I did actually. I have a whole new hat that has updated logos and everything on it, but this is the original hat, original
Very cool.
robe. So
Very
figured
cool.
I'll go retro today.
Just had somebody join the chat from Boston. Let us know where you're chiming in from. We'd love to hear that kind of information. Also, the chat is a place for you to throw in your questions, your comments, and my favorite, snide remarks. So give us a hard time as we build some actual flows and workflow rules here. So Brian, I've set this up so that you can sort of, guide and control the screen here. And I think you've pulled into the actual workflow rule area. Let's talk about what kinds of things we might want to do with a workflow rule that we can then replace.
Well,
So, as someone who
yes.
go ahead.
Well, I was going to say workflow rules are probably the simplest automation that Salesforce has had for
Yep.
over a decade. And quite simply, a rule is made up of uh, three components. It's the when should the rule fire, the criteria,
Hmm.
any immediate actions that happen, and any time-based actions that happen. And that's pretty much it. The actions that you can do are pretty limited compared to some of the automation tools. We can do a field update on the record that triggered the workflow. We can send email alerts. We can do an outbound message. We can create a task, and that's it. Not a whole lot
You know,
else
what?
we can do.
Wait, we can do one other thing. We can do a cross-object workflow rule, right?
Oh, you mean like update the account? Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So, but they are the sort of the, I don't know. I always thought of them as like the simplest possible thing. And I have to admit, as somebody who grew up writing code, workflow rules have not always been my go-to. Right? Sometimes I go for the I already have a trigger in place. I'll just put that field update in the trigger. And so I always have to go and refresh my memory as to what the workflow rules are available to do. But as we have this, let's go ahead and look at creating a workflow rule. Now we're in an org it's a Scratch org that I've set up with Apex recipes. And so we're going to go ahead and create a workflow rule, and then we're going to create and set up all of those three pieces that Brian just talked about. And then we're going to look at what it would take to replace that with a flow instead. So Brian, let's use the account object.
Okay.
And what should we do with our workflow rule? I mean, sky's the limit.
Let's do a field update, and then let's do a time-based email action.
Time-based email action. Okay, so we're going to do a field update and then say 8 hours from now, send us an email?
Something like that, yeah.
Okay. I'm wondering to see how long I can hold out wearing this costume, because it's a little hard to see everything.
I took the hat off. Hat doesn't fit well with headphones, and it constantly droops down.
Yeah.
You know, that's not a good sight for online.
Wow. Okay, so we're going to do a field update. So let's do a new rule. Actually, I'm going to let you do this, and I'm going to narrate with snide comments while you talk about this.
Count.
Yeah. Be interesting. What does he name it? Count as customer. Okay. Oh, look at that. He is filling out the description object, which is another spooky site. How many times have we sort of blown past the description field when we create something in Salesforce? It's pretty... Okay, and this is going to run whenever it's created or anytime it's edited to meet the criteria. So the criteria you're putting in here, okay. Type. Little.
That's customer direct, customer channel, since that's so small.
Nice. Okay, I'm going to ditch the helmet here.
You're going to ditch the head?
Can't do Stay Puff much as I want to. Okay.
You can't stay the Stay Puff?
I can't stay the Stay Puff. It makes me feel all marshmallowy headed. So you've got this account type. It's got the two different things in it.
Yep.
And that's cool. And we're going to fire this workflow rule anytime one of those two things is met. But I don't see it actually doing anything. Like, where's our workflow?
No, this is just the first step, which is all about the criteria, when it's supposed to fire.
Okay.
So we have to hit save and next.
Jennifer Lee says that she always fills in the description field. It's the best practice, and I think she's giving you kudos.
Oh, thanks, Chad.
Yeah.
So here, now we can actually specify what the actions are. You can see things are broken up as immediate workflow actions and time-based workflow actions. So let's start with the immediate stuff first.
So a workflow rule has those three things, some of which are actions. Actions are different than the workflow rules. Okay.
Yes. And so if you haven't created them already, you can create them from this little button to create a new task, new email alert, new field update, or new outbound message. And the key with this is these are new, as in if you already have a field update created, you wouldn't select new field update here. You would select selecting action. So this really should say new field update action, not versus you adding a field update. And field updates are really easy. You give it a name, and we have to figure out what are we going to update on the account when they become a customer. Let's do the account number.
$42.
Oh, that is the answer to life in the universe
and everything.
Yeah, so we should do that.
Yep, 42. Okay, and then we got this customer is the answer to life, the universe, and everything.
Yeah.
And then
so we select the field we're updating, and then we wait for it to refresh. And we can either set as a blank value or we pick a formula.
So if we set it to a blank value, it's going to overwrite anything in there and just sort of nullify the field.
Right.
Okay.
And then the other thing we can do with this is we can say, hey, when this update happens, go reevaluate all your workflow rules. So if you had something in place where you had another rule that says, hey, when the account number is 42, do this, you would need to check that box because otherwise that rule wouldn't up run until someone edited the account again.
It seems like it's basically the do I want to open the recursion can of worms checkbox.
Basically.
Okay.
So now we can see there's our immediate action right there. And I believe we're going to do a time-based action, right?
Yep.
So let's add a time trigger.
Now, why are they called time triggers rather than time actions?
Because in this case, this is when should the action fire. So it's a trigger based on time.
Oh, I was going to go with it's because naming things is hard.
Well, naming things are hard, but you know, but we could do things based on a specific dates. Like we can make this after the last modified date, or if we had a specific date that they became a customer, we could base it off of that. I'm going to be really lazy, and we're just going to run this 1 hour after the real trigger date.
Fair enough. Now, if I remember correctly, that 1 hour is, maybe not perhaps 60 minutes exactly, but
it's
pretty close.
60 minutes plus or minus what the pod has availability actually to do. But
yeah,
it's pretty close.
Okay.
Let's do an email alert.
Okay.
Okay. And I actually don't like doing email alerts from here because of this. You have to have the template already created. And I don't have a template created. So I need to go create a template quick.
Yep. I was going to say, I was going to navigate away, but you opened in a new tab. You cheated.
Yeah, I cheated. It's almost as if I've been doing this for 10 years.
Yeah, something like that.
Mm-hmm. And then you always have to check that box so you don't forget.
I just wondered why that checkbox is there. Like, why would you want to create
it? I can't think of a single time I've ever made a template not available.
Exactly. We're going to send the email. Okay.
Next.
Well, you didn't give it a subject.
I don't have to because it's a custom email template. It's HTML. The subject comes in on the next page.
Oh, well, that's fine. Customer created. Yes. Bored that you're yelling.
And there goes my phone. Excuse me. I thought I had that closed.
It was me calling. You know, the classic Halloween movie thing. The phone call is coming from inside your house.
It's coming from inside the show. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
All right. So now, in theory,
hey, somebody named Doug is saying that you're a Flohana, and I just wanted to let you know that I'm here for that pun. I'm here for that.
I like it.
So
let's see. Who should we send this to?
Oh, security user.
Security user.
I'm sorry.
Sure. We'll send it to the security user. Let's send it to the account owner. We could send it to a whole bunch of people, but we'll keep it simple. We won't add additional emails. Sure, make it to the curve. It's fine. Great. All right. So now I have my email alert. There's my email alert. There's my field update. If I wanted to, I could add additional actions that happen at 1 hour after the trigger date, or I can add additional time triggers, which basically means different time frames. So if I wanted something to send out 8 hours after, I would add another time trigger. But I think that's our workflow rule.
Yeah, that seems. I mean, we've got two things going on. So when the account, let me back up. Remember, workflow rules have 3 parts. They have the
criteria,
rule, which is the criteria, the object they're going to run on, and then the actions associated with them. And in this case, we've got both an immediate workflow action of a field update, and we've got a time-dependent workflow. So an hour after this, we're going to get an email alert. Now, our workflow actions are somewhat limited in that you get, let's see if I can remember off the top of my head. You have email alert, you have updated field, you have outbound message, and you have
New task.
New task. Okay. It's always the task one I forget.
Yeah.
So we had an announcement at Dreamforce, and in case you missed it, the announcement, and I don't have PR approved language here, but it's like, hey, why don't you use flows instead of workflow rules? That's how I'm going to phrase it. So as we look at say maybe building flows instead of workflow rules for our new projects and our new needs, how do we go about doing that? Because this seems like it'd be something that could be either deceptively simple or seemingly simple but actually really hard.
I would say if I was going to rank them between, say, workflow rules being the simplest to, hey, I'm writing Apex triggers, um, for most people who can do all of it, I would say flows are smack in the middle. And the reason for that is you do have to think about it a little bit differently than a workflow rule. There's some vocabulary that is inherent in a flow that is not in a workflow rule, but they're not that difficult, especially when we're talking about migrating an existing workflow rule. Most of the flows I've built to do that have been really, really simple flows. We're talking like 1 to 3 element items in it. And if you don't know flow at all, we'll see what elements are down the line here. But yeah, I mean, for a lot of people who've been living and breathing workflow rules, all their admin life, moving to flow can be scary, but it doesn't need to be. It's not as
I'm going to be
difficult
honest
as
with
what
you.
people think it is.
I'm going to be honest with you. As somebody who writes code every day, moving to flow is a little intimidating.
Declarative first, Kevin.
Yes, I'm on board with that. I'm
Right?
still saying that it's intimidating. Okay, I'm
And
not
it can be.
disagreeing.
I mean, the challenge that we have with doing flow is there are different things we have to think about. Um, for example, if this was going to be on on an object where our org does tons of imports, where we're importing through the API or maybe data loader IO, hundreds of thousands of records at times, I may not choose to do that type of automation in a flow. Um,
Why?
I may keep it in workflow rules. I may keep it in Apex. And the reason for that is flows are bulkified differently. Um,
It's an
and
interesting way
meaning
of putting it. Bulkified
by
differently.
differently. Yeah.
Okay.
Um, and so depending on what your automation is doing can have a big impact on whether or not it will hit a limit whenever you're doing a bulk update like that. And unless you kind of know what those limits are and how that packs into it, it can be really challenging for people who will build something and go, hey, when a user goes and creates or updates an account, it works great. But then I do this big data dump and things break and not being able to know why. It's not really going to be an issue when we're talking about workflow rules if that's all you're doing, because a workflow rule is very, very simple. And so the flow is going to be very, very simple. But we could do so much more in flow that if you build a flow that runs when an account gets edited or created, and it does a lot of stuff that is going and grabbing other records and looping through them and things like that, where the logic is more complicated, you can run the risk of hitting limits when you're doing bulk applications like importing 5,000 accounts as an example. But it depends on what is the flow actually doing. For something like this, I wouldn't be worried about it. If we were doing things like, hey, every time the account meets this criteria, let's grab all the opportunities and all their opportunity products and let's update them all with a particular field with the date that they became a customer or something like that, I would go, we could do that in Flow, but then I wouldn't be able to do a data import against accounts with a large uh, transaction size.
All right. So that was a lot of theory dumped on
Yeah.
everybody, and I appreciate that. But actually, let's go and build one of these and look at it and see what it looks like to build a flow that would replace this particular workflow rule. Because then I'm going to get complicated and ask you hard questions like how many flows should we have on an object, and
Yeah.
How do we bulkify it so that we can run it on 5,000 imports?
So we're going to do a literal one-to-one in this particular case.
Yep.
And we'll get to it, but that may not necessarily be the best choice depending on what you're trying to do. But we're on the flow screen. We can see all our wonderful flows listed. And I always like to do this now. Okay, so we only have trigger flows on orders and process exception platform events. Nothing on account. We're good to go. So I'm going to go ahead and click new flow. And the first thing we get to do is basically say, well, what type of flow we're going to build. And we have a whole bunch of choices, from things that have screens to things that are auto launch or scheduled and record triggers to um, even the orchestrator beta that's hidden over in the template area. But what we're going to do is record triggered. Anything that you're doing to mimic a workflow rule is going to be a record trigger flow, because we need it to happen when a record is edited or created, and that means it's triggered by a record.
It also seems like if you wanted to replace a trigger with a flow, you would also look to the record triggered flow.
Potentially, yes. Most
Yeah.
likely. So we'll select that, we click next, and then we get our choice between freeform and auto layout. What's your poison, Kevin?
Uh, so I'm a stickler for having my code look pretty, and so I'm gonna go with auto layout because that'll make it look prettier.
Prettier. Okay.
Yeah, that's what I use to make my code pretty. I use prettier. So, I want this to be prettier.
Mm-hmm. So when we select it, the first thing we have to do is kind of configure the start. And this is similar to putting in the criteria for the workflow rule. So we have to say, well, what object are we going to fire on when we're doing accounts? Okay. We are going to do it when our record is created and edited or updated. And we have some criteria, meaning what is the criteria for the flow to fire? And if we remember correctly, that was when our account type was
Customer.
customer. Well, specifically, it was customer direct and customer channel. So I'm going to do it this
Oh,
way.
you're gonna do. Well,
Yeah.
that's an and. How do you do it to or?
I'll flip it right here.
Oh, gotcha. See, that's unintuitive to me. I would expect to, be able to click on the and word and.
I mean, technically speaking, I probably, if I had known I was going to be doing this, I would have set this first.
That's fair.
But,
That's fair.
it works. And then we have, well, when do we want to flow to update the records? And we're going to say every time it meets the criteria, or when the record is updated to meet the condition requirements. So this is basically the equivalent of the workflow selection we did, which was or subsequently meets the requirements, meaning that if they're currently customer type and you edit and save the record, the flow won't fire. But if you don't have a customer type that's not the customer, and then you flip it to customer, it will fire.
Gotcha.
Okay. And then we have our choice between fast field updates and actions and related records. And this has to do with, when does the flow actually fire? Does it fire before the record saves to the server, or does it happen after the record saves to the server? And this is a choice we don't have with workflow rules. A workflow rules always happen after the record is saved. And so if we were going to replicate this perfectly, we would select actions related to the records. If we were just doing field updates, we would do a fast field update, so it happens before the record is updated. And the reason for that is it's faster. It takes less time. It's just a better choice.
So
And
since we
this
have
is something
both
we can
a
always flip if we make a
okay,
mistake.
but because we have a field update and a time trigger, do we have to do actions and related records, or can we do the fast field update?
Well, if we do the fast field update, I'll just hit done. You can see here that we just have this one path. We don't have a choice to do anything that's to say like a time-based path. So if I flip this to be actions related, now you can see we have this scheduled path option.
Oh.
Okay.
Okay.
So if we're going to do this as a one-to-one, meaning I'm going to have one workflow rule and one flow, we're going to do an after um, actions and related records and do the path and immediate actions here.
Okay.
If I was doing something a little bit more, I might do something different. But for right now, let's start this and then we'll talk about why we may not want to do it this way. But let's start with the field update.
Okay.
So we're going to hit the plus sign and we're going to go to update records.
I love how you're consistently filling out the description.
After many years of going back and going, why did I build this way? I've learned you pretty much have to do this. And then we can say, well, what record are we doing an update? The easiest one is the account record that triggered the flow, but we could update records that aren't the account. We could base it off of an ID or related to it and whatever. So we'll get to the number. I believe the value is 42. Okay, so that's the field update. That's done. Now let's do the email, and we'll do scheduled path. And I believe
Oh, I see how you can label these.
When the account is created after, the offset number is basically the equivalent of how long. So this is hours after. And then we could enter the batch size. And so this is one of those neat things that if you had a big transaction, you can say, hey, I want these to fire one at a time down the schedule path. But if you put nothing in, the default is 200, which is pretty much the default for most bulk transactions, it seems like.
Yeah.
We'll leave it blank for right now because I don't think there's a reason for us to decrease the batch side with this particular flow. So once we define the path, we can see we now have 2 lanes. We got our run immediately and our 1 hour after. We just hit the plus sign. We're going to do action. And this is one thing I really love about email actions. I don't have to custom create an email at all or do the template or define it in the flow. I have the account customer notification action accessible as a flow action. So all I have to do is select it. Give it a name.
Interesting.
And then we give it the ID of the record that is going to be used to basically do the merge fields and everything like that. And for that, we go down to $ record and we select account ID, which is just ID. There it is. There, flow built.
But we haven't specified the template or anything like that.
We don't have to because we specified it in the email alert that we used with the workflow.
So you're reusing the email alert workflow
Waste
action.
not, want not. I like recycling.
Well, I mean, I totally get that, and
yeah.
But if workflows are retiring, how would we do the email alert without using that workflow action?
Well, there is a different action that we can select. And we have all these different things here, including email. And there's a default called send email. And the send email is very, very simple. It's you put in what your body, basically what is in the email, you give it the subject, and you select where is it going to go to through the email addresses options here. Essentially, it is the equivalent of creating the email template and the email alert all at once. But I tend to avoid this where possible because I find that email alerts are a lot more friendly to do things like, hey, the email template changed. I need to swap out the email template. Or the recipients change. Whereas if I need to do this as in a flow, anytime that the recipients change or the body of the email changes, the flow needs to be updated and a new version created. Which means if I'm working in a team of people, uh, everyone either needs to be fluent in flow updates, or I have a process now where my workload is going to be involving updating a flow. So it's kind of like the ability to make declarative friendly code. In this case, it's declarative friendly declarativeness.
And there we have the quote for the stream. Declaratively friendly declarativeness. So, Brian, I guess the thing that I'm curious about is if we are going to sort of embrace flow as the future and to really strive not to do things in the workflow updates or the workflow rules realm of things in our org going forward, what other option do we have other than doing this send email, simple email, for sending that email alert?
Well, it depends on what is the intention behind the email alert. So, for an example, if the real intention is you're sending a message to let people know that you got a new customer, um, email alert has always been kind of like the default. People kind of eat, live, and breathe their email inboxes, but we do have other ways to do notifications with Salesforce. We don't have to do email. We could do a custom notification. So that's the push notification you would have on your phone or the little red bell that we get in the upper right hand corner. That's one way. We could do a chatter post instead. As a matter of fact, I often like to do a chatter post where I at mention the specific users that need to be at mentioned in the post, because I kind of get the best of both worlds. I get my chatter post, but then if they have their system set up to be notified by email, when they get at mentioned, they will also get their email.
Yeah.
Um,
And I'm guessing, I don't know for sure, but I'm guessing sooner or later we're gonna have send a Slack message available here. Okay, so I'm hearing from you that out of the box we don't have a better way of we don't necessarily have a great way of doing that sort of email template reuse that we have in workflow rule
well,
actions.
not in standard Salesforce. So
Yeah, and out of the
the
box.
yeah, the out of the box for the non-box software, right? The unofficial SF website does have, I believe it's called Send Better Email, and
It's a bit on the nose, don't you think?
it's a bit on the nose. Yeah, it's a bit on the nose. But it's similar to this, where we could specify the body, we could specify the subject and things like that. But it also gives us the option to specify an email template instead. So instead of having to use the flow to control what's in the email, as well as who it's getting sent to and when it's getting sent, we can use the email template and say, hey, we're going to control the body and subject of the email in the template. And the email action will just say, go use this template.
Now,
Um, it's it's pretty slick.
now out of curiosity, Mohit is asking which of our email limits are we going to potentially hit here? And I don't know the answer to that off the top of my head. I know that there's a different email alert count than sending emails, like from
Hmm.
Apex. I, I'm not entirely sure which which governor limit applies here, and I think that's a fantastic question.
That
Do
is
you
a
know
good
if there's
question.
a specific governor limit for flow actions sending emails?
Not for email that I'm aware of.
Okay,
I think it
yeah,
falls under the same email limits that we have, just like where workflow was running, which is what, like 2,000 a day or something like that.
that's one of the ones I always have to look up because I never
Yeah, I
remember.
always have to look it up too.
Yeah. Okay.
Um,
Well, that's good. I'm Mohit. I don't have an answer for you off the top of my head, but I'm going to look into it and try and find one for you, just not on stream. So I'm going to put together a show notes doc for this, and like I do for recruiting for good, and then I'll link it in the YouTube video link, so you'll be able to see what we talked about and all that sort of jazz. So we've duplicated our workflow rule 1-to-1. Earlier, you mentioned that this may not you may not want to do a 1-to-1 switch. Why?
There could be a couple of reasons. One of them is you have a lot more workflow rules that fire on the account. And instead of having lots of different flows, you want to kind of consolidate things. So, like actions are paired with like actions. Um, it could also be for the fact that you want to optimize and take advantage of the things like, hey, we can run a flow to do a update to the account before it hits the server. And so if we were looking at this workflow rule, I would say, hey, I might take two flows out of this one workflow rule where I create one that happens before the trigger and is updating, um, doing the field update, and then one that is the time based trigger that does this 1 hour after. Uh, it really will come down to what else we have out there for that. But I'm a big fan of, if you have a lot of workflow alert or workflow rules that are firing on one object, to look through them all and bundle them together where it makes sense. So, in one circumstance, I actually have a flow that runs, and instead of, or the real simple, hey, you run immediately update the records. I don't have um, I don't have criteria specified here, and I do decision elements to say, do this action, do that action, which makes it kind of similar to how Process Builder works, right? Where we have a trigger, which is the object on the account, and then we have all those little criteria node diamonds where we say, well, this is when these set of actions fire. I like that for things that are like immediate update actions, or actions where they're updating other records than the one that got triggered. However, if you have anything that's time based, the only way you can control the when should this fire based on this time path is with the criteria in the start element. So,
Hmm.
right? So if you had, say, 5 different workflow rules, they all had different criteria. Let's say we use opportunity stage, and you have, after 1 hour, send a different type of email notification after every stage. Then you'd end up having to have 5 flows that are on firing after 4 opportunities, where the criteria is stage 1 or stage 2 or stage 3, and then your scheduled path after that. So it is different from workflow rules in that regard, where the criteria is paired in the start of the element.
That's really interesting because I was going to ask one of the you've ever listened to me stream or give a presentation, you'll know that one of the hills that I gladly die on is that you should have one trigger per object. Um,
Hmm.
and and as I think about this, my thought was, well, you should have one record triggered flow per object. But what I'm hearing from you now is that's just not possible if you have time based workflow actions
Yeah,
or time
my
based
rule of thumb
actions.
is bundle like actions as much as possible on one flow,
Hmm.
unless they're time based actions. Because we
So
don't have a good choice right now.
So it's this is almost sounding like an insurance commercial. Bundle home and auto and save. Uh,
Yeah. I
so
mean,
if we can, we want to bundle it. But
right.
if we need time based, we can't. That's
I
the end
mean,
of the story.
we could get clever on this, right? We could say
Mm,
the trigger is at any time the stage is changed. And then 1 hour after, we have a decision here that goes through and says, if it's stage 1, do this action. If it's stage 2, do that action. If it's stage 3, do that action. We could do that. Um,
that sounds like an awful lot of tedious work that is error prone.
Potentially, and it really kind of comes down to, well, what else do you have happening with your automation? This is where having a really nice overview documentation of what your automation is doing is very useful to have, because you can take a look at it and start saying, oh, all these need to happen together, or I can group them together a certain way, or no, I need to have distinct flows because these are all time-based actions.
Now, that actually dovetails really nicely into something that Chandra is asking. They're saying we had time-based workflows in setup where we could monitor when the workflow with the time trigger was going to be executed. Is there anything like that for flows too? And I don't know that there is a. Is there a sort of
Yeah,
monitor of
so
flows that are going to execute?
they're paused.
Oh, I had. So if it's time-based, it executes and then pauses.
That's my understanding that this is basically the equivalent.
Oh, okay.
Now, there's some problems with this, okay? And one of them is if you have something that's time based, and let's say the person who triggered it leaves your company, right? This happens with
That never
workflow rules
happens.
now too. Whereas if the person who basically scheduled the item to happen is deactivated, then the action fails when the action attempts to happen. The user has to be active at the time that the action occurs. Um, and the challenge with paused time-based actions with flows is it's really difficult to go through the list and go, okay, which of these 150 paused actions are waiting on Jerry because Jerry just left the company and I need to cancel action and then get it rescheduled.
That makes
So
sense.
yeah, they're
I'm having trouble connecting. I'll keep trying.
okay. Please keep
Something
trying to
started
connect.
talking to me. I'm not entirely sure what. Uh, that's awesome.
Yeah,
I
that's
have
great.
something talking to me on my desk. Um, okay, so we have an issue, known issue, kind of. I don't know that I call it an issue. A known limitation is what I'm going to say, where time-based paused interviews have to be re-enabled, relaunched, or
It's the same thing as workflow rules.
unpaused.
If the user becomes deactivated after the action gets scheduled, the action will fail when it
What about
tries to
frozen?
reinitialize. I'm sorry, what about what?
Frozen.
Frozen?
Yeah, frozen user.
That should still work
Okay.
because
Okay.
Frozen just
It
prevents
seems like
people to log in.
it seems like this would be a great place for like a custom Lightning Web component that would be able to find flows that are they're paused by deactivated users, and bring it to the attention of a system administrator.
Right.
That's
And
another show.
then you have to figure out, well, if this action needs to happen, how do you re-engage it so the action happens when it's supposed to? And that's a whole different ball of wax.
Jennifer saying she thought flows also appear under time-based workflows and setup like workflow rules and processes. And I don't know the answer to that one. Chandra says thanks for the info, by the way. But let's look at time-based workflows and record trigger
It does say
flows. There it
include
is.
schedule paths for record trigger flows.
Hey, there you go. There's another way to look for it. Thank you, Jennifer. That's super nice to know. More than one way to.
And this one at least lets you search by user ID.
Yeah. So now you can go back and find all the ones by Jerry who left you in a lurch. So that's
Right.
good. It's good. Now you mentioned earlier in our thing that flows are how did you phrase it? They're bulkified differently, which in my head, like alarms went off because I'm so used to Salesforce understanding of bulkification that to now that there's a second model of bulkification here, my hackles went up. So can you walk us through the differences and what impact that may have when we're converting a workflow rule into a flow like this?
Yeah, there's not too much of an impact on our particular example because it is very, very simple. It really comes into play more so when you're dealing with more complicated logic flows. But generally speaking, um, the way flow kind of gets bulkified is any of the DML. So basically, anytime you are creating or updating records, those tend to happen like as bulk. But if you have other things in there, they may not happen as bulk. As in, if you have 10 records, each one will go through each element individually and then get kind of merged back together again to have the update happen all at once. that really causes more of a concern when we're talking about um, flows that are doing a lot more complicated logic. And I'll give you an example of that. So right now we're doing a simple, hey, we're going to go update an account. But if we said, because this guy is a customer or this person's a customer, I also want to go and I'm going to get all the opportunities.
Oh boy, here we go.
Tune eties.
Cody, take the wheel.
Say, spell sales correctly. Select our object where the ID is equal to our account record ID.
Wait, I think you want a different field. I think you want
Why?
account ID.
Oh, you're right. That needs to be account ID. And we'll get all the records. We'll still order the fields. And then we go through and say, you know what? Let's go loop through the opportunities. And then for each opportunity, we're going to, let's see what would be a good thing. Let's just do a simple field update.
I love how you just, rattle this off.
It's almost as if I've been building flows on the fly for a long time. All right.
Yeah.
So we'll set the value. We'll go find the description equals new customer.
While you do this, I got another question I'm going to answer.
Yes.
Harish wants to know, can we extract the paused flows from Workbench or Dev Console? And you can get you can sockle for the flow interviews and the flow record relation record. Is it flow relation record? I believe. And so you can sockle this information. You can pull it out and do things with it. I'm not entirely sure if that's what you mean by extract the paused flow from the Workbench, but you can run a sockle query from the Workbench, and then that sockle query can return to you the flow interviews based off of a status of paused or not, or what other criteria that you would like. There's another object, the flow relation record. I think I've got that. It's either flow relation record or flow record relation, one of the two, that ties a particular flow interview back to a particular record. And so you can use those two objects in relation to one another, along with, say, an opportunity ID or an account ID, to find a interview that is paused based on its interview status related to an opportunity or a record that you're looking at. So you've got, I feel like you've added a whole bunch of stuff here while I was describing that. Tell us what you're working through here.
So here's what I have. We got an opportunity. We're looping through the opportunities. We have an assignment here that assigns the description value for each opportunity in the loop. And then for each opportunity in the loop, we're adding it to a new collection. So just a list of opportunities. And at the very end of it, outside of the loop, we update the record, all the opportunities, right? So this is a little bit more complicated, and this could work like multiple times. And then you get to that one account that used to be a customer years ago, becomes a customer again, and they had 700 opportunities underneath that account. Well, that means when we get here, we have one record, which is our account. We now get 700 records from the opportunity, and we have to loop through. And each one of those 700 goes through this loop. And the problem with that is Flow has a limit of the number of elements that can be gone in a single transaction, and that's 2,000. And loops are dangerous in this regard because in this case, we have 3 elements, which means if we take 2,000 divided by 3, it's approximately 666. And that means if we have 660 records or 667 records, the flow will hit the iteration limit and go is the technical term. And so that's one of the examples where you kind of do have to think through it a little bit, but this is something that you can't do with a workflow rule. So if all you're doing is migrating your workflow rules over to Flow, this isn't a big concern. It's
Right.
only going to be a concern if you're starting to expand out what you can do with your automation.
Now, just out of curiosity, the way you described it with this kind of looping and the sort of complexity, my first gut instinct, and again, it's because this is more what I'm comfortable with, would be to write a trigger.
Hmm.
And I understand how to write triggers in such a way that it will always be bulk safe and succeed. How is it that you could fix this so that you're not going to hit that iteration limit?
There's a couple ways you could do it. You can say this particular action, I'm not actually going to um, do the update in the flow. I'm going to do the update someplace else. Maybe you go through and say, I have a scheduled flow that the scheduled flow is going to query all opportunities for customers that became new customers as of yesterday. And because schedule flows run one record at a time in the transaction, it's not a problem.
Hmm.
Um, right? So that's one way, but it kind of depends on what do you need your automation to do and why. If I
And
can't wait to do it once a day,
isn't there a limit to flow invocations per day?
yeah, but I don't think a lot of people are going to be hitting that unless you're going
Okay.
really hog wild. Um, I mean, like really crazy.
Where there's a
Uh,
will.
yeah, I've worked with some large companies that like there's pages and pages of flows, and it's not a problem.
Okay.
Um, right. So that's one way to do it. Another way is you go and say this piece of automation shouldn't be done in the flow. Let's go do it in Apex.
And you just call the
Right.
apex from the flow.
Well, that's one of the ways you can make an invocable action and have this basically say, I'm going to give the Apex the list of opportunities and have Apex do all the updates, which will limit this down to one element instead of three, or actually instead of four, because we wouldn't have to do the update either.
Hmm.
Um,
I see.
right. But then you always have to have the discussion with the person who's writing the Apex of, well, why should I write something that allows you to invoke it from flow when I could just write this specific use case as a trigger when a utility class and be done, right?
Oh, the answer to that
Um,
is so that the Apex developer doesn't have to write it again.
or again, and it comes down to like how many
Right. That one's
examples do you
simple.
have this? Yeah,
Yeah. No.
right.
Okay. So they're bulkified differently, and it has a lot to do with the limit on the number of elements in the flow being executed in a particular transaction. Is there any way to have a flow that has other flows in it that are broken out into separate transactions?
Yeah, and
Can you
those are
do it
called
that way?
subflows. But the only way that you're going to be able to break it into a separate transaction is if it's paused in some way or form.
Ah,
Um, right?
so the
And
only way to
so,
reset that 2000 is to pause it.
right. Or you pass it over as, hey, 1 hour after we're going to do these actions instead.
What's the minimum amount of time we can delay it?
That's a good question.
Ooh, I love good questions.
I think they made it change it so it's minutes after.
Hmm. Is offset number a whole integer? Or can you do? Yeah, exactly.
It accepts zero, but zero isn't truly zero, right? It's
Right.
as
As
soon as
many
possible
as soon
type
as
of thing.
possible. But okay, that's
Yeah,
an interesting. That's an interesting interpretation of the rules. I'll put it that way.
right. And to be fair, I have not tested that to see exactly how what happens.
Right. Right. Okay.
But with Process Builder, you can do a 0 hours, and my guess is since a flow is being created by Process Builder, it's probably going to work similarly to that.
Okay. Okay. Um, so just as we're at a moment where we can recap here, today we've talked about what workflow rules are and workflow actions. We've built a workflow rule that had an immediate action and a time triggered action, and then we replaced that with the same functionality in a flow. Um, if we think about sort of like the final steps in replacing a workflow trigger and a workflow rule and a workflow action with a flow, it seems to me like the next step would be to save this and then to go disable that workflow rule. That
Yep.
okay? I'm not missing any steps here. What are we doing now? Or are we saving
I'm saving the flow.
Okay. Jack wants to know what error message will be thrown by the flow if a transaction limit is exceeded.
If it has to do with too many elements, it'll give you basically something along the lines like an iteration error. Another potential one is CPU. There's like a CPU time limit. I haven't purposely been able to hit that yet. I usually hit the iteration first.
Challenge accepted.
Yeah, I may have to play around with that. And then with the workflow row, we never actually activated it. So it's already deactivated. So we would hit the activate button. Now, there is one thing, Kevin, that would be a good idea to do whenever you're doing flows that do DMLs. And that's what's called a fault path. And essentially that means if something goes wrong with this update, these are the things you want to have happen. If this was a screen flow, I would have a screen say, hey, we tried to update the account and something went wrong. Here's the error. Because it seems like 9 times out of 10, it's a validation error, right? Where you try to update the account, but the account is out of a validation role. But this way, the flow kind of ends more gracefully. You will still get the flow email debug to say, hey, there's a problem. But we could do this to say, you know, an error occurred. Let's go post a chatter message, just say, hey, we tried to update this account. The account didn't get updated, and notify the account owner. So maybe they can go through and do the manual update, or send it a separate email so you can give yourself different information than what the debug might give you.
It seems like this is so two thoughts here. One, this seems like the catch block of a Apex step, and this seems like the perfect place for you to fill in all the details to yourself that you're not going to get in the email that you get. I find the emails that I get when a flow error occurs to be early on the usefulness curve. I'll put it that way. And so, you know, getting this information be really useful. We do have 2 more questions that I want to run by you before we're running. We got 3 minutes left here. So Jack wants to know, Jack was the guy who asked about the error message being thrown when you hit that iteration limit. He wants to know if it's ever going to be unable to lock row, and I don't think unable to lock row would apply in this case. It may be. I've never run into it in this situation. I usually run into unable to lock row. Well, honestly, I usually run into unable to lock row when I've got data skew going on. And if you're not familiar with data skew, I think the architects have an article on data skew, but it's where you have a one-to-many relationship where you have too many to one, and that can cause issues when you're trying to update various sides of that relationship, being able to lock the row for update when the others are being updated and vice versa.
I mean, there is a circumstance where it could happen.
Yeah. Say more.
Yeah. So this particular update is setting the account number, right? Well, if I'm sitting on the account, we'll get to an account, and I'm sitting in the edit screen for this account. There it is. Right. So the account number is currently null. Well, if a salesperson goes and says, hey, this is a customer, and changes it to be the customer to be from partner to customer, right? And saves, I'm still in the edit screen, right? The flow has now updated this record, and if I had saved, you get something along the lines of this record was edited at or saved in something along those lines. My guess is it's a similar type of error, but honestly, I don't run into this in practice very often, unless you're dealing with things that are where you have child records that are updating parent records, and you have multiple people kind of touching the same type of thing. And even then, it happens rarely.
That's cool. The last question we have, and we don't have a whole lot of time for it. Chandra was wondering, how performance intensive are flows as opposed to workflows?
Oh, that's a good question. I don't know off the top of my head, and it kind of depends on, well, what is the flow and workflow we're doing. If we were going to do just the field update and we were doing a before triggered flow, the before trigger flow is substantially faster and less system intensive than the workflow rule is. If we're doing everything after time based, it might be a little bit slower. I can't remember. There was someone who did a bunch of testing on this and compared workflow rules, flows, and Apex, and had this nice little pretty chart. But it basically showed anytime flows doing things after, it did take a little bit longer, but from an end user perspective, it was negligible.
Very nice. Very nice. Well, Brian, I want to thank you for coming on the show today and for talking through workflow updates and how we might sort of update them for the next 10 years of our Salesforce orgs. We talked about these being the undead. I call them undead. Workflow rules aren't going to go away anytime soon. It's not like we're going to pull the rug out from under you and get rid of your workflow rules, at least in the near future. But we do want you to consider using flows instead. And so we've talked about how to move these to flows, and that's really great. And I really appreciate you coming on the show. I am not a flow HANA. I'm sort of a flow newbie, and I still feel way more comfortable in code. So I think part of it is because the syntax highlighting is weird. Like, what do those colors mean? Anyway, so Brian, thank you for joining me, and we'll see you all again next week on codeLive. Same bat time, same bat channel. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.